Ben Willis, also known as the Fisherman, or as the urban legend, the Hookman, was likely born around 1956. We can guess this due to the fact that that was the year that his wife was born, and they were likely around the same age, along with Ben's general appearance when we see him in 1997, looking like a man in his 40s. While there's no documented information about where Ben Willis is from, it seems likely that he was born on the East Coast due to his general demeanor and the fact that he would go on to work as a fisherman for many years in the small town of Southport, North Carolina. There's not much of a record of what Ben Willis was up to from his birth until 1977 when his daughter was born, but it would make sense that much like many of the young men in Southport, Ben would have started working as a fisherman around age 18 or 19, assuming he finished high school first. He would eventually use this skill to move to the Bahamas, where he was employed working on the boats at a resort, Tower Bay, with his wife Sarah, where they'd have 2 children, Susan, or Susie, in 1977, and they also had a son shortly after, who I'll get to soon. But according to rumors around the resort, Ben was an abusive husband.
People say he would beat her. People say a lot of things.
This may have had something to do with another rumor that was being shared around Tower Bay, that Sarah was having an affair. So when she went missing one night in 1980 and the honeymoon suite in Tower Bay was found covered in blood, it was assumed that she had been murdered by an angry Ben Willis, especially after Ben and their 2 children disappeared from the Bahamas and secretly moved to Southport, North Carolina. For the next 13 years, Ben would live without any further scandals in the small town of Southport, where seemingly no one knew the truth about his past with his wife. But that would all change in the summer of 1996, when Ben was run down by a group of teens, survived, and decided to bring the urban legend of the Hookman to life in order to enact revenge. To learn more about why Ben Willis took on the Hookman persona, how he modernized the 1950s guilty conscience trope to torture his victims in the post-Scream 90s, and how his legend would live on to haunt teens in generations to come, stick around to the end of this video. How's that for a hook? Welcome to Horror History. If I had a nickel for every time an iconic slasher villain from the 90s tore up his victims with a hook and provided a commentary on urban legends over the course of 2 theatrical films, a straight-to-video sequel, and a 2020s requel, I'd have 2 nickels. But it's really weird that it happened twice. Since I already did the other example with my Candyman Horror History episode, today I'll be cruising out into Hookman territory.
What are you waiting for, huh?
Hey, these videos take a long time to put together, okay? But in order to thoroughly understand the true lore of the Hookman and how it ties in with Ben Willis's motivation to kill the teens of Southport, we'll need to take it back to the early 1950s, where the Hookman legend began. The earliest stories of the Hookman can be traced back to about the mid-1950s, when this folklore started gaining popularity through word of mouth. The first known documented version of the story came in a Dear Abby submission, which was a newspaper advice column where readers could ask life questions in the days before Reddit, AITA, and ChatGPT. The original 1960 article reads, "If you're interested in teenagers, you will print this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it served its purpose on me. A fellow and his date pulled into their favorite lover's lane to listen to the radio and do a little necking. The music was interrupted by an announcer who said there was an escaped convict in the area who had served time for rape and robbery. He was described as having a hook for a right hand. The couple became frightened and drove away. When the boy took his girl home, he went around to the open car door for her. There, he saw a hook on the door handle. I don't think I will ever park to make out as long as I live. I hope this does the same for other kids." This story would continue to spread and influence pop culture as we know it. In the post-World War II 1950s, sensual liberation was beginning, where a lot of younger people began questioning the strict moral codes around premarital activity, which were often established by religious authorities in order to prevent couples from doing it before marriage. Everything goes back to religious horror. This liberation movement inspired a counter-movement, a pushback to clamp down on those traditional beliefs. Suddenly, there were movements to attack abortionists, and local law enforcement also started taking a renewed interest in obscenity laws. Groups such as Citizens for Decent Literature started protesting the sales of erotic books and magazines at local newsstands. It makes sense that in this time period, which was a battleground for the morality of premarital activities, a story would emerge of a hookman who makes teens engaging in intimacy suffer. In fact, my friend and fellow creator, John Solo, did a video where he speculated that the Dear Abby submission was written by an adult trying to discourage teenagers from doing it.
"I don't think I will ever park to make out as long as I live. I hope this does the same for other kids. There's no way this was written by a teenager. This has to be someone's corny-ass mom trying to scare local teens out of some late-night canoodling."
So the way that this fable and others like it operated was to scare teens out of participating in behaviors seen as morally deviant. This way, it's not parents and adults lecturing teens, but the threats that there are harsh and terrifying consequences for the behavior, outside of anyone's hands. Pun intended. I don't know if there's necessarily a name for this phenomenon, but you know when you see a really effective horror movie and it sticks in your head that night? I think that was the idea with these horror legends, only the memory of the scary story would resurface around popular teen date spots. Pretty clever way to psychologically manipulate them. And getting even more analytical here, I also see a symbolic motif in the image of the hook itself. The story attempts to use guilt to discourage teens from breaking those moral codes, and the hook sticks into whatever object you try to penetrate with it, just as guilt digs into the characters and cannot be easily shaken off. Looking at the timeline, this hook story would have been rising in popularity right around the time that Ben Willis was born. He would have grown up as the story was circulating. Clearly, it had an impact on him, and he would take the legend into his own hands. Or hand. Summer is here, and that means two things: beach season and being hunted down by a vengeful fisherman with a hook for a hand. But if you're trying to outrun your past and a killer, it helps to have some energy, which is where Factor comes in. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, and dietitian-approved meals straight to your door. No grocery shopping, no cooking, and no cleanup, which is perfect if you're on the run from someone who knows what you did last summer. With over 34 weekly options including Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, Keto, and Vegan, it's never been easier to eat right and feel good in your body. Unless you have some dark secret and you're overridden with guilt. Factor won't help with that. But it is convenient. Personally, I love Factor because it helps me stay on track without having to think about it. It's quick, it's healthy, and it gives me more time to focus on what matters, like figuring out who left that creepy note on my mirror. Ready to eat better this summer? Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50CZ to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free shipping. That's factor75.com with code 50CZ because this summer, the only thing that should be chasing you is your goals. As I mentioned, Ben and Sarah had a son who we never learned the real name of, but later on in 1998, he went by the name William Benson. I doubt that's his actual name, because we find out that it's an alias, which is also an attempt at one of the dumbest jokes ever.
You'll get it! Will Benson? Benson!
I feel like he came up with that thinking it would be this mind-blowing revelation, but forgot his audience wasn't like 5 years old. What did the buffalo say to his son when he dropped him off at college? Bye, son. No other name for Ben and Sarah's son is ever mentioned, but it would be difficult to believe that they knowingly named their child Will Willis. But then again, in my high school class, there was a Steve Stevenson and an Ivan Ivanov, so I guess anything is possible. For the sake of this video, we will continue to refer to him as Will. In the years after the birth of the kids, the story of the Hookman had evolved into a much broader concept, the slasher subgenre in horror. Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Billy Loomis. Some of these villains are intentionally crafted with morality play in mind.
Hey, you want a beer? Or we can have premarital sex. We love premarital sex.
While others seemed to unintentionally reflect the immoral anxieties of society at the time. This serves as proof that the way that the tropes from an urban legend shift as it's passed from person to person is not always what the storyteller intended.
And the boy, all hot and bothered, he gets pissed and peels out.
No. That's not the way it goes.
Being one of the most perpetuated urban legends in American culture, the story has been fractured into an innumerable number of versions, with each alteration shifted by the personal views of the storyteller. In fact, we've seen it on a macro scale in the pop culture depictions of the Hookman legend. Many are familiar with the version of the story published in the iconic children's horror anthology book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, depicting a couple named Donald and Sarah getting scared away by a scratching sound at their car door. But due to many other adaptations of the tale, everyone has their own idea of how the story actually goes. An episode of Supernatural depicts the vengeful spirit of a local minister. The 1992 movie Candyman features a hook-handed man terrorizing Chicago as a metaphor for racial segregation. The 1997 anthology film Campfire Tales features a version of the story taking place at another venue for teen friskiness, a drive-in movie theater. And the 1999 movie Lover's Lane attempts to give the Hookman a backstory as an escaped mental patient. Even the true crime film Zodiac from 2007 features a couple oft under very similar circumstances to those described in the original Dear Abby column. In 2012, the story was even adapted into a pretty well-known 4chan meme, which is honestly only remembered for how poorly it's written. Man and girl go out to drive under moonlight. They stop at a side of the road. I think the engine is broken. I'll walk and get some fuel. Keep the doors locked no matter what. I love you, sweaty. The girl hear a scratching sound and a voice say, let me in. The girl doesn't do it, and then, after a while, she goes to sleep. The next morning, she wakes up and finds her boyfriend still not there. She gets out to check, and man door hand hook car door. A truly chilling tale if you're an English teacher or writer or even just not completely smooth-brained. Anyway, Ben Willis took the spirit of the telephone effect altering the story and ran with it, projecting his own views onto every version of the Hookman lore that he knew of. Between 1981 and 1994, Ben raised his children while working as a fisherman in Southport, and as far as we know, kept a low profile. While not a lot is known about the son's childhood, we do know that Susie went to public school and in high school met a boy named David Egan. By the time of their graduation, the two had gotten engaged. But just a month later, this romance was cut short when David and Susie got in a car crash on July 5th, 1994, trapping Susie in David's car and ultimately resulting in her drowning at Dawson's Beach. Understandably, David feels terrible about losing his fiancée to his own reckless driving, but little did he know, her father was planning a visceral revenge, taking an entire year to thoroughly plot his retaliation. We don't know if this was the case when he killed his wife, but his payback on David Egan establishes a pattern that falls in line with the main theme of his character. His actions from this point on all take place 1 year after the incident that triggered his vengeance. This allows him to inflict the maximum amount of torture. He lets his own victims' guilt eat away at them, then, at the anniversary of their crime, digs deeper into their conscience by letting them know that someone is aware of what they did. He's taking advantage of what psychologists refer to as the anniversary effect, the experience of grief, loss, or trauma before and around the anniversary of a significant event. This is a concept that we've seen before in the slasher genre, through Laurie Strode suffering a mental breakdown around the anniversary of the babysitter murders in the Halloween requels, and in Scream 4, where Sydney struggles to cope with the 15th anniversary of the Woodsboro murders, returning to her hometown and sorting out some unfinished emotional business. But I Know What You Did Last Summer explores the anniversary effect with a deeper psychological depth. The year after Susie's passing, on July 4th, 1996, Ben sends David Egan a direct threat with a note that reads, "I will never forget last summer." Ben Willis's ominous Independence Day note seemed to have the desired effect, to inspire guilt, leading David to drive out to the spot that overlooks Dawson's Beach where the car wreck happened and Susie drowned 1 year earlier. David looks at Susie's necklace that reads the words, "I love you." It seems likely that this was a gift that had been exchanged between the two of them. While David is sitting on the edge of the rocks overlooking the water, Ben uses the opportunity and David's vulnerability to attack him. We don't know exactly how he did it, but eventually he dumps the body in the ocean, which is found later that year. He most likely didn't use the hook based on the story in the paper.
His body was caught in a shrimp net not far from Miller's dock. It was in the paper. I think the police called it an accidental drowning.
And the moment where he got the idea to adopt the Hookman persona would come a little bit later. On that same night, recent high school graduates Helen Shivers, Barry William Cox, Julie James, and Ray Bronson all go out to Dawson's Beach to engage in drinking and the type of activity that the Hookman legend warns against. And naturally, this leads the teens to start discussing the Hookman. In 1996, the era of self-reflective or meta horror movies was taking off, propelled by the success of Scream. Like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer is a teen horror flick with a dash of mystery that is dripping in irony. And the two were always going to be compared, with both being the work of screenwriter Kevin Williamson, just 1 year apart from one another. But the Hookman isn't a simple rehash of Ghostface. I think he serves a different purpose, in many ways taking what Scream did for horror movies and applying that to urban legends. In particular, each has characters who have an amazing ability to be self-aware about being in a horror story, but somehow not introspective enough to grasp the danger that puts them in. In Scream, we've got Randy Meeks, a character who openly refers to horror movie tropes as rules, warning his classmates against doing it, drinking, and saying the phrase, "I'll be right back," as he and all of the characters at the party proceed to do just that.
I'll be right back!
Ray, Barry, Julie, and Helen do something similar on the beach that night. They're clearly all aware of the Hookman urban legend because they argue about the version differences with one another, but they also deliberately ignore its lesson. Instead of being wary of a hook-handed man, they proceed to hook up with one another. They also fail to realize that the version of the legend that each of them is familiar with is a direct reflection of their own character flaws. Barry's version of the story resembles the take seen in Lover's Lane, with a couple in a car hearing a radio report about an escaped patient in an asylum with a hook for a hand on the loose.
So the girl, she gets all scared, right? She wants to go home. And the boy, all hot and bothered, he gets pissed and peels out.
This tracks with Barry's own short fuse, and is not dissimilar to the way that he treats Helen, his girlfriend, as the night wears on. In Ray's version, the guy wants to protect his girlfriend.
That's not the way it goes. Okay, the boy goes for help, and the girl stays in the car, and she hears this, like, scratching sound.
This version reflects Ray's own insecurities about not being equipped to be the best provider for Julie, as she comes from an upper-class family and Ray comes from a working-class family, sometimes creating tension in the relationship. Helen's version of the story is the most graphic.
Not a scratching sound, it's a drip. Drip. Drip.
No, It's scratching because the guy's been hung from a tree limb and his feet are scratching on the roof of the car.
No, he's been decapitated and it's the blood from his severed neck that's dripping on the car and it's going to drip, drip, drip.
It might reflect the fact that she takes on a lot of personal responsibility for reining in Barry's rage and reckless behavior. It's less about the details of her story and more about the fact that she's willing to stand up for what she believes is the true version and correct him on his mistake. Julie's ultimate take might be the most telling though. She doesn't believe any of it is real and seems eager to prove that she can outsmart the lore of the story.
Please. It's a fictional story created to warn young girls of the dangers of having premarital sex.
Her response echoes the same sentiment as Randy Meeks from Scream. All of these angles of potential insecurities or vulnerabilities would be brought to light a year later when Ben Willis came after them. But first, why did Ben Willis come after them? After he had just taken care of David Egan, while trying to leave the scene, he's run down by the car of the 4 graduating seniors right around the same spot where David and Susie got into their crash the previous year. The group believes that they just killed the guy and debate what they should do. Julie is adamant that they should go get help and call for the police, but Barry, Ray, and Helen all point out that there's no version of the events where they're not found guilty for manslaughter or being complicit in manslaughter, which would destroy all of the bright futures that they'd each hoped for. During this argument, they see Max, another guy from their class, approaching. They quickly move Ben's unconscious body and stage a scene, making it look like they'd pulled over because Barry was feeling sick, which seems to do the trick. The group decides that the best thing to do is dump the body into the ocean, ironically the same thing that Ben just did to David Egan probably less than an hour prior. The group is already feeling the effects of a guilty conscience, so Barry suggests that they reframe their mindset.
Let's just pretend you're some escaped lunatic with a hook for a hand and we're doing everybody a favor.
This comment could be what Ben heard as he was drifting in and out of consciousness, playing a role in the persona that he'd take on to exact his revenge the following summer. But in trying to dispose of the body, the teens get a surprise that complicates things even further. Once they arrive at the dock, Ben finally comes to and grabs Helen, pulling her beauty pageant crown off as the group pushes him into the water. Barry dives in to get the crown back, making sure that there's no evidence tied to them, but after retrieving it, he leaves Ben for dead. The crown probably made it easier for Ben to figure out who Helen was, and by proxy who the others are, but it's also a symbol of potential. The whole reason they agreed to get rid of Ben's body in the first place was to ensure that their bright futures were not ruined by the consequences of the incident. Helen's pageant crown was a literal byproduct of her bright future. She had just won a local contest with big plans to go into entertainment.
At summer's end, I plan to move to New York City, where I'll pursue a career as a serious actress. It's my goal to entertain the world through artistic expression. Through art, I shall serve my country.
So the idea that Ben is literally ripping that crown away from her is no accident. The winner of the pageant itself is called the Croaker Queen, an honor named after a fish called the Atlantic croaker, after which their annual 4th of July festival is named. But now, for Helen, it'll always be associated with the guy who croaked in the middle of the night thanks to their actions. Or so it seemed. Between the summer of 1996 and 1997, Ben survived and recovered from the accident, all while taking his time plotting revenge on his 4 biggest new enemies. But even before he starts to enact his punishments, all he has to do is sit back and watch as the group's internalized guilt does plenty of damage on its own. Julie self-destructs, nearly failing out of college and ending her relationship with Ray. She finds out from a newspaper that the body of David Egan was found and assumes that he must be the man that they killed. Ray also finds this information and finds himself having a brief fling with David Egan's grieving sister, Missy, as he tries to absolve himself by getting close to David's family. That can't be a healthy coping mechanism, no matter how you frame it. Helen and Barry also broke up, with Helen dropping out of school and moving back to Southport, working in her sister's store at the fragrance counter. And Barry seems to be thriving.
Hey! What are you two doing here?
But he doesn't stay that way for long. On July 2nd, 1997, Julie arrived back in Southport after completing a session of summer school, and with the anniversary of the incident just 2 days away, Ben began his psychological torture, starting with a note in Julie's mailbox reading, "I know what you did last summer," with no return address. The guilt alone was already creating issues in her life, but now, the idea of potentially getting caught adds a new layer of stress. And since they believed that Ben was dead, there wasn't much worry from his end. They would never suspect him of being the one to send the notes. As the group reconnects, Ben springs into action, taking his first victim of that summer. But surprisingly, it isn't any of the 4 teens who were in the car that struck him. It's Max, the graduate who just happened to roll by just before they disposed of Ben's body. His first victim is someone who has nothing to do with what happened, so what gives? There are a few potential reasons that Max could be targeted. Maybe for his stupidity in not picking up that the other 4 were up to something shady. If he had thought more of the fact that the car looked damaged, for example, he might have realized what they were up to and been able to get Ben help and taken him to the hospital. However, Max probably wouldn't actually feel guilty like the others, so there was no reason reason to keep him around as the other four got more and more desperate to uncover who was sending the notes. This makes Max the perfect first victim. By killing Max, who by the way was using a hook during his job at the docks, he's eliminating the person that the Southport 4 most suspect of being the one who knows what they did last summer. Not having a lead on their investigation is naturally going to make them panic more because they don't have control of the situation. Also, Ben Willis, ironically, doesn't seem to have a moral compass of his own. He's okay with killing an innocent person just to scare his real victims. It's basically a chess move that tells them whoever knows the truth might try to kill them next. He's planting the idea that the urban legend that they discussed is real. But it is different from the original version that was immortalized in the Dear Abby advice column back in the 1960s. In the nearly 40 years that passed since the liberation movement, attitudes around intimate encounters became a lot more relaxed, and in 1997, premarital stuff wasn't exactly a hot button issue anymore. The hippies came in the 60s, no pun intended, and adult themes were pretty much commodified by the 1990s, being used to sell everything from blue jeans to shampoo to soft drinks, and being the subject of some of the biggest shows like Friends and Melrose Place. Marching out the Hookman in the 1990s as a condemnation of certain premarital relations would have been the equivalent of having a gay character in a sitcom in 2025. It's just not taboo anymore. But something that was still taboo, and would remain that way until like 2020, is manslaughter. So this was the position that I Know What You Did Last Summer took with the Hookman. It was a 90s evolution of a folklore icon that had used morality play to scare generations going back to the 1950s. And Max Nurek had just become the first to learn about this new MO in the most gruesome way possible. After killing Max, Ben continues to torment his victims with the idea that their secret will be revealed. He set a trap for Barry by stealing his jacket from a gym locker in exchange for the words "I know" scrawled on a photo of Barry's car, which he steals and uses to drive him down, landing Barry in the hospital. Although Ben has multiple chances to kill Barry, he leaves him alive, again banking on the idea that their own guilt and dread is a greater agony than death. But that's not to say that death is not in his plans. The next day, July 3rd, Ben targets Helen. He spies on her in her room as she's treasuring her pageant crown and reminiscing about winning it. He seems to have an understanding of her vanity and how important her appearance is to her, so while she's asleep, he cuts her hair and writes "soon" on the mirror. Just like with Barry, he chooses to leave her alive to maximize her humiliation. When July 4th arrives, Ben has mapped out plans to kill each one of the four that chose to disregard his life the year prior. To start the day off, he plants Max's body in Julie's trunk, covered in crabs. It sends a message, almost rubbing it in her face, that they have no idea who's stalking them. Ben also cleans it up really fast before she can gather the others to show them, which makes it look like she's lost her mind. I do feel like this method of psychological abuse was specific to her. She's probably the most intelligent of the group. She has the most practical response when they get themselves into trouble. But the other side of that is that she's also the most guilt-ridden, so gaslighting her into thinking that she's seeing things is gonna bother her more than it bothers the others, which it definitely does.
What are you waiting for, huh? What are you waiting for?
And this becomes a common method of attack that Ben uses against her repeatedly. Ray finally gets his turn receiving a letter from Ben later that day, but notably doesn't attack him, making the others suspicious that he could be involved.
Oh, you got a letter. I got run over. Helen gets her hair chopped off, Julie gets a body in a trunk, and you get a letter?
What are you talking about?
Drop the act. You killed Max. You took my jacket.
It's hard to say if creating this rift was intentional, but it does break the group apart long enough for the mysterious fisherman to make his next catch. Ben takes his next victim at the 1997 Croaker Queen pageant. The Southport 4 had suspected danger since Helen was required to be there to pass off the crown, but he flips the script on them by going after Barry instead of her. He's keeping watch from the balcony at the time that Ben sneaks up behind him, and Helen is the only one who can see the attack, making her look crazy to everyone else. The deputy who ends up taking her home furthers the idea that there's no one set backstory to the Hookman. Ben Willis is taking an avatar and making it his own.
You know, I've heard this story before. Except the way I heard it, it wasn't a fisherman, it was an escaped mental patient who had a hook for a hand.
As the deputy takes a humiliated, angry, and terrified Helen home, Ben kills him in front of her, then chases her to her sister's department store and takes her out as well, showing once again that he's not afraid to whack innocent people to get to those who he's really after. I personally think this is hypocritical. The whole reason that he hates Julie, Helen, Barry, and Ray is because they unjustly decided to dispose of him. He's basically doing the same thing to these innocent people. For me, it kind of makes the character less interesting. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The most interesting villains are those who believe what they're doing is justified. Although I don't see it as justified, we know that he's a psychopath, so I can at least understand him going out for revenge on his cheating wife, his daughter's killer, and the teens who tried to dump his body. But it's just hard to even imagine Ben finding a justification in his own mind for taking out the innocent cop and the local shopkeeper, outside of the fact that they were just in his way. I do like how he finishes off Helen though. You'll remember a major reason the group did what they did last summer was not to tarnish the reputation of the Croaker Queen due to her plans to move to New York City and garner attention in the entertainment business. What Helen valued the most was the attention of onlookers, but in her death, after noticing Ben posing as a mannequin to get the jump on her and being chased out of an upper window, she's caught and hooked and left to croak in an alley as a literal parade goes by without noticing her at all. The final two survivors are Julie and Ray, who are brought together on the docks, but when Julie mistakes Ray for the killer due to the name of his boat and he runs after her trying to explain, Ben has a perfect opportunity to knock him out and isolate Julie on his boat under the false pretense that he'll help her contact the authorities. There, he finally reveals that he's been using the Hookman lore to enact his personal revenge, putting his own twist on the imprinting of his moral beliefs on the youth that the original story is designed to perpetuate.
That's a shame, being it's 4th of July and all. Kids like you should be out having fun, drinking, partying, running people over.
This line kind of bridges the gap between the old 1960s moral purity lesson regarding unmarried couples getting busy in cars and the 1990s version, which involves murder and dodging moral responsibility like I discussed earlier. So Ben traps Julie on his boat where he tries to kill her. She discovers that he's been hiding the bodies of his victims on ice in the fish hold. However, before he manages to get to Julie, Ray comes to, finds a small motorboat, and boards Ben's vessel to save Julie by, funny enough, knocking him down with a suspended hook. Julie and Ray go to fight against Ben, and in another stroke of irony are able to defeat him when his hand is caught in a tangle of ropes and amputated by his own industrial fishing equipment, before his body is flung into the ocean where they, once again, left him for dead, despite the advice he just gave Julie moments earlier.
And let me give you some advice. When you leave a man for dead, make sure he's really dead.
In hindsight, they probably should have assumed that an experienced fisherman could swim, even with just one hand. In fact, it seems like these seafaring types end up losing a hand more often than not anyways. It's become such a trope that losing a hand almost feels like a rite of passage. I looked into this phenomenon a little bit, by the way, and it seems like the stereotype of pirates and sailors having a hook for a hand, a peg leg, or an eye patch is mostly an idea perpetuated by Hollywood, with Captain Hook from Peter Pan being mostly responsible for popularizing the idea, but it does come from a place of truth. As it turns out, firing cannonballs at enemy ships exposes you to a lot of gunpowder and explosions, which are dangerous, not to mention all of the heavy-duty equipment found on fishing boats, climbing up ladders to the crow's nest, and a lack of medical resources in the middle of the ocean. When people got hurt, a hook or peg was the most effective option. In Ben Willis's case, he had already spent a year developing the hook-handed man persona, so when he actually lost his hand, he probably just saw it as a sign to continue. And although Julie and Ray believed that they'd finished him this time, he continued to appear in her nightmares as an everlasting manifestation of the guilt that she felt that year. Sometime between the summer of 1997 and July of 1998, while continuing to heal from his amputated hand, Ben Willis enrolled his son at Julie's University, Cambridge, under the name Will Benson, allowing him to get closer to her and befriend her. On July 1st, 1998, Julie is again in summer school, but nightmares about the Hookman continue to haunt her and her sleep schedule. Will takes this opportunity to play a support role towards her, while trying to drive a wedge between her and Ray, even getting her friends to try to set the two up at a nightclub. Given that Ben has stated that he doesn't like kids being out and partying, you could look at Will's actions as bait for another moral purity test, tempting her to choose debauchery, especially considering that Ben's life of crime started over his cheating wife. Throughout the night, Julie keeps seeing Hookman everywhere she looks, causing her to have to leave early. It's not completely clear if Ben really was in Cambridge stalking Julie, but I'm leaning more towards the idea that the figures that she saw in the nightclub were just hallucinations, because one of them seems to completely disappear, and even Will seems kind of bewildered when she mentions that she saw something. It also makes sense that if she were going to have a dissociative episode, that it would be a few days before July 4th, thanks to the anniversary effect that I talked about earlier. Because the next day is July 2nd, 1998. Will fakes the voice of a local radio DJ, 96.7 Mark in the Morning, and calls Julie's unlisted number, which her friend Carla answers. With a trip to the Bahamas on the line, Carla is challenged to name the capital of Brazil.
Rio. Rio de Janeiro.
She's wrong. It's Brasilia. But the fake DJ acts like she got it right and won the trip, because Ben's plan involved getting Julie to the Bahamas during the storm season, where there wouldn't be many witnesses around. Julie excitedly invites Ray, who is now working as a fisherman in Southport, about a 12-hour drive from the college in Massachusetts. He makes plans to drive up and surprise her, having no idea that Ben Willis is alive and one step ahead of them. As Ray and his friend Dave drive out to surprise Julie, Ben sets a trap, placing a mannequin in the road. I wonder if that's the same one he removed from Elsa's shop to jump scare Helen the previous year. But more importantly, he creates a scenario that's familiar to Ray, a man laying out on a quiet road in the middle of the night.
The guy looks dead, man. Maybe not.
It seems Ray has learned his lesson, but it's another example of Ben Willis using his victim's guilt against them. Turns out he doesn't care that Ray has gained some empathy. While he's investigating the mannequin, Ben kills Dave and chases Ray down in his own truck, similar to what he did to Barry exactly a year ago to the day. Ray dives over a guardrail and takes a fall, putting him in the hospital. I guess Ben should have taken his own advice.
When you leave a man for dead, make sure he's really dead.
When Ray doesn't show up the next morning, Julie thinks that he chose not to join her and agrees to go with Will, Carla, and Tyrell instead. The group travels to Tower Island, a small isolated island only accessible by boat. When they arrive, the hotel manager, Brooks, tells them that they're about to enter the stormy season, and a huge storm is headed their way the next day, leaving the island isolated apart from just a skeleton crew of hotel staff. This was Ben and Will's plan, to get the group alone on the island where he could pick them off in the same spot where he and his family used to live and work. Ben even goes so far as to put them up in the honeymoon suite where he killed his wife. Ben arrives on the island and once again burrows his way into Julie's head using subtle paranoia. He rigs a karaoke machine to display the words, "I still know what you did last summer." Hold up, Mr. Hookman. Are you referring to last summer, like when you tried to kill us? Or 2 summers ago when we almost killed you? Because if you're referring to last summer, we didn't really do anything bad. And if you're referring to 2 summers ago, you need to change your statement to, "I know what you did 2 summers ago." I guess that's not as catchy as a movie title though. In yet another touch of irony, the song Julie is singing on the karaoke machine is "I Will Survive" by Gloria Gaynor, a statement that could apply to both her and her hook-handed antagonist. Julie leaves in a panic, unable to relay to her friends what has happened. In a further attempt to both gain Julie's trust while also keeping her on edge, Will goes up to her room to immediately surprise her with a note in the same handwriting as the one she got last summer and stands behind her with champagne and roses, scaring her. His plan works, and she apologizes for being startled at the gesture. Ben's first kill on the island is the deckhand Derek, allowing him to untie all of the boats, cutting off their only means of escape. Next, he cleans up the housekeeper. As we established earlier, his psychopathic tendencies are such that he doesn't mind taking out innocent people in order to freak out his true victim, Julie, just a bit more. And just like he did the previous year, he plants Derek's body in her closet, but removes it while she runs to get everyone, not only gaslighting her and everyone else into thinking Julie has gone insane, but also calling back to the incident the previous year in her trunk, sending a covert message to her that the foreboding fisherman has found a way to survive yet again. But this time, he also has the aid of Will, who floats the idea that Julie might just be experiencing one of the PTSD dreams that she's been having as of late. In the background, Ben continues to take hotel staff out of the equation, using his hook to pin the stoner pool boy's hands down to a table before finishing him with a giant pair of shears through the neck. On July 4th, 1998, the big storm is in full force, ensuring that the ferry that takes people off the island will not be running. Ben continues goading Julie, but this time in a way more violent than before. At some point in the morning, he puts the head of the housekeeper in the dryer to scare them. If the miner from My Bloody Valentine were here, he'd be so proud. His next idea to kill or at least harm Julie is the most 90s thing possible, trapping her in a tanning bed. If Death from Final Destination 3 were here, he'd be so proud. I don't fully understand why a beach resort in the Bahamas would even have a tanning bed though. Like, just go outside, touch sand.
Wow, cancer in a box.
Nah, this is the safe son. Come on, Julie, it's better than a day on the beach, girl.
Anyway, Ben comes in while Julie is using it, zip ties it shut, and cranks it to the highest setting. It's most likely at this point when Ben goes to the resort to kill Brooks, the hotel manager, by stabbing a machete through his head and writes the words "I still know" on the wall of his office. He also destroys the radio so no one will be able to call for help. If Jack Torrance were here... After the group discovers this and the rest of the bodies lying around, Julie confesses the events of the previous summer and her theory that Ben was not dead and was now coming for her. I don't necessarily think that getting her to confess was his ultimate goal, but I see it as more of a byproduct of his primary objective. As a living manifestation of an urban legend, he wants to guilt his victims, and anyone who hears his story, into a desired behavior. And psychologically manipulating Julie to the point of revealing her darkest secret would probably be an important achievement for him. It'd be like if someone got me to reveal what the CZ stands for. At some point, he also must have visited the burial place of his wife and daughter and prepared a third gravestone, and this one has Julie's name on it, with a date reflecting the current date, July 4th, 1998. And as strange as it is to have a tanning bed at a sunny beach resort, it may be even stranger that they would have a graveyard on such a small island, and that the resort would have allowed Ben to move his daughter's body from Southport to Tower Bay just to be buried next to her mom, who he killed. In any event, the survivors are not stopping to think about plot holes. They're busy gearing up with weapons in the kitchen.
What are you gonna do with those? You gonna butter them?
But Tyrell ends up getting himself buttered in front of everyone when the Hookman finds them and drives the hook up through the back of his neck. Ben chases the group to the attic, giving Julie the creepy realization that Ben had been able to watch everything that had gone on in their suites from above. He grabs Carla, and the struggle sends them both crashing through the window, and shortly after into the locked greenhouse. Ben is able to corner her there, but she manages to escape through a window on the locked door with a little help from Julie and Nancy, the resort bartender. By the time Will emerges again, he's covered in blood. The group assumes that it's his own blood, that he'd been injured by the killer, so Nancy and Carla go to search for a first aid kit, leaving Will and Julie alone. That's when Will reveals the truth about the radio contest and about his true allegiance.
You get it? Will Benson? Ben's son!
I mean, it was pretty obvious who he was, even without that incredible line, but it seems to have become one of those so bad it's good moments, if the Letterboxd reviews are anything to judge by, so I guess I'll issue a pass for this line. Meanwhile, Estes stumbles in, mortally wounded with a fishing gaff run through his body. In his final moments, he collapses onto Nancy, allowing Ben to skewer both of them in one motion. It seems that this time his victims have no shot of getting away, until an unexpected traveler emerges. After journeying all the way down the East Coast, hiring his own boat and braving the ferocious storm, Ray shows up to save his girl, and go face to face with the Hookman one last time. Ben tries to talk him out of it.
Think about it, boy. You're no killer. That's my job. You don't have it in you.
Which seems like an odd statement to make to someone you're literally punishing for trying to kill you multiple times, along with the fact that you've been dialing up the guilt as much as possible. But unfortunately for Ray, the gun does not fire when he pulls the trigger. Julie manages to get loose by biting Will's hand, but this just causes Will and Ben to both lay a beating onto Ray. However, their teamwork ends up being their downfall. When Will props up his victim for Ben to finish him with the hook, Ray dodges it, causing Ben to accidentally stab his own son, taking out the last remaining member of his family. Before Ben has time to redirect his aggressions onto Ray, Julie figures out how to use the gun and unloads the entire chamber into her summertime slasher, causing him to fall into the grave plot that he had opened for her. Although this one wasn't written by Kevin Williamson, the new writer, Trey Calloway, wasn't afraid to sprinkle in some of that trademark irony. It would appear that Ray and Julie are in the clear. They went on to get engaged and buy a house, but as Julie is getting ready for bed one night, things seem off, and the Hookman appears under their bed, grabbing Julie by the ankles, which most likely means that even with her fishy foe dead and buried, the guilt-induced trauma and hallucinations may always continue to haunt her. With the entire Willis family neatly buried in a row on Tower Island, you'd think that would be the end of the Ben Willis timeline, and it may be, but I've still got one more summer to recall, this time in a place called Broken Ridge, Colorado, which isn't a real place like Southport, Cambridge, the Bahamas, or Brazil, but it seems to be a feeble attempt at Breckenridge, Colorado. On July 4th, 2004, a group of teens, Amber, Zoe, Roger, and Colby, learned all about the Southport Four and the Hookman that came after them, which really shows that we've come full circle in the life cycle of an urban legend.
On the 4th of July, this guy goes crazy. He kills a bunch of kids in his little fishing town. Supposedly, it was some kind of revenge.
Just like how the Southport teens accidentally gave birth to the idea of a Hookman in their town after telling stories of different versions of the legend that they had heard, this new Broken Ridge Four is now recalling their story and passing it along. The urban legend lives on by word of mouth, the way that real urban legends often do. But instead of simply passing on the tale via oral tradition like those before them, these new kids go one step further, trying to scare everyone at the 4th of July festival by having one of their friends, Roger, dress up like the fisherman and pretend to attack their friend PJ, who would escape in the most 2000s way possible, by performing a skateboard trick. Roger purchases what he believes to be the actual hook that was used to kill all of the people in the Bahamas, which is a needlessly accurate costume detail for the prank and may have been a vessel by which the spirit of Ben Willis became connected to them, if that is indeed what happened. The first part of their prank goes well, but the skateboard stunt goes horribly wrong when there's a miscommunication about placing the mattresses and PJ is ultimately impaled on a pipe. Just like Helen, Julie, Ray, and Barry, these kids also promised to never tell anyone what they did. However, unlike the teens from Southport who could have been charged with manslaughter, these teens' biggest crime was probably just disorderly conduct and maybe reckless endangerment at the very worst, which is a misdemeanor in Colorado. What killed PJ was him choosing to do a stunt that went wrong. Even if the others were involved in the scare prank, they probably wouldn't get their lives ruined over it. But whatever. They seem to think it's a big enough deal to hide the truth and spend the next year living with a dark secret, or at least a dirty secret, just like the teens of Southport did 8 years prior. On July 1st, 2005, Amber received 50 text messages that all say, "I know what you did last summer." which is accurate, but it does raise questions. If Ben is legendized into a supernatural entity that punishes those who hide their heinous crimes, how is he sending SMS? Amber runs and tells her best friend Zoe, who believes her, and despite not speaking since last summer, they agree to work together to find out who is behind the mysterious messages. The following day, Amber and Zoe try to explain the situation to Amber's ex-boyfriend Colby at his lifeguard job. Ooh, lifeguard, but they killed someone. So ironic. He, of course, doesn't believe them, until noticing his own note, written on the dry ground in water, reading, "I know what you did." I would almost certainly assume that I was being pranked if I was in his position, but for whatever reason, he does not. Later that day, as Amber is riding her bike through the mountains, someone damages her tire, and she has to take a gondola back down, during which she sees what appears to be the fisherman that she had read about, and he smashes the glass, but ultimately lets her live. We've seen this pattern 2 times before, and I'll always know what you did last summer basically adds nothing notable to the formula. So I'm honestly gonna zip through it all because I'm getting bored and I don't want you to get bored. The first victim comes later that night when he shows up at Roger's job at the gondola station, because apparently the whole fucking town revolves around gondola rides, and he uses his trusty hook to gut him like a fish.
You hang up on me again, I'll gut you like a fish.
Wrong franchise. And that night, he also scribbles the word soon on Amber's bulletin board where all of her photography is displayed. Once again, playing on the idea that her secret is going to ruin her future career, much like how Helen was toyed with in '97. The following day, the culprit continues destroying people's stuff. He leaves the words "you know" etched into the motorcycle of PJ's cousin, Lance, who was not actually part of the prank, but was aware of what they did and never told anyone. Then, Zoe's guitar is destroyed while she's asleep. And back at the pool, where Colby is swimming after hours, he incurs a big slash on his ankle. Finally, as it always goes, a bunch of kills go down on July 4th. Zoe tells the others she plans on performing at a talent show at the 4th of July festival after hearing that some Los Angeles music agency reps will be there scouting talent. So they all decide to stick together. Except they don't do that. Zoe retires to her dressing room after the performance. But when Amber and Lance come to congratulate her, the Hookman comes out from behind a mannequin and chases them until Zoe goes off on her own, then he splits her open with the hook. Immediately after Zoe, he goes on an absolute rampage, taking Sheriff Davis and Colby down in the process. In the end, he comes after Amber and Lance, but this time, the Hookman is unlike anything we've seen before. The local deputy, Hafner, shoots him with a rifle, but it does nothing. Later, the Hookman is run over by a car, but still gets back up. At this point, Amber and Lance see the Hookman stand up and get a good look for the first time at what appears to be some kind of zombie or reanimated entity or evil spirit, which Amber assumes to be Ben Willis.
It's the guy from 10 years ago who killed all those kids. It's a legend.
And that is where I've got to pause and set the record straight. While you could certainly make the case that the spirit of Ben traveled to Colorado through the fishhook from the Bahamas and is now haunting a new generation, let's look at the facts. His face. This is clearly not the face of Ben Willis. Now, if that were the only piece of evidence, I might be willing to look past it. Characters do get recast all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a new person, but there's more. Ben Willis lost his right hand and literally had it replaced with a hook. This new Hookman, as we can clearly see right here, is holding the hook in his hand. He does have a hand, which might be what he used to send those text messages, because there's no way a literal zombie is marching into Singular Wireless and getting a plan. Like I already mentioned, I Know What You Did Last Summer is always viewed as a franchise following in the footsteps of Scream, which features a whole lineup of copycat Ghostface killers trying to recreate the crimes of the original. We've even seen a killer don the Ghostface mask and robe while wearing a bulletproof vest underneath to give the illusion of immortality. So who's to say this new Hookman didn't just have a knack for zombie makeup and to do the same, helping him survive the gunshots, and we already know it's very possible to survive a car crash in this universe, making the protagonists think that they're dealing with the second coming of Ben Willis.
What was it black coming out of his arm?
Probably blood. It looked black because it's dark out. Shortly after, he chases them into a garage and Amber stabs him in the foot, releasing what appears to be blood, but it looks black because, well, it's dark out. It does seem to prove that he's a physical entity rather than a ghost or spirit. Hoping they've lost him, Amber and Lance run out to a construction site, but they're followed by their trench-coated tormentor, who nearly kills Lance, only coming up short when he gets a taste of his own medicine. Amber gores him in the back of the head with a loose hook and finishes him after this line.
The secret dies with you.
She shoves him into an industrial shredder, finally destroying him physically and releasing herself from the guilt that she'd been living with over the past year. If Laurie Strode were here, she'd be so proud. But just like Julie, Amber will forever be disturbed by what happened. Another year passed after this, and she finds herself on the road in Nevada, heading towards Los Angeles, where she seems to be living now. But when she gets out to investigate a blown tire, the image of a Hookman appears behind her, and she screams. But given that there was no one out there anywhere near her just moments before, she's probably experiencing the same dreams or hallucinations that Julie did when she was in college, meaning that the legacy of the Hookman may always be there in some form to torment her. Now, if you want to alleviate some of your guilt for not yet having subscribed to CZsWorld, then make sure you subscribe to CZsWorld, and make sure you ring the death bell and select all notifications, and I'll see you next summer, assuming we both survive.